Not all institutions are reformable.
I used to be very proud to say that I work for the UN. Now I'm having second thought.
Bureaucracy, bureaucracy, bureaucracy.
It's almost like this very traditional concept of marriage.
Yeah.
Whether you are happy or not,
Stay for life.
stay for life. And what got you interested into, criminal justice?
It started from my childhood. I was born in Uganda. It's in East Africa. And during that time, the country was going through conflict. There were armed soldiers on the roads, adults and children facing death, and also in fear of losing their lives, and people trying to run away to a place of safety, so that they don't get killed. And at that very young age, I had seen dead bodies and body parts in the streets, and daily on TV, anyone considered a government rebel faced death by firing squad. And this was broadcast live on TV. So you can imagine as a child watching that. Now, the picture in my mind is very vivid. Men lined up with hoods over their heads and shot by armed soldiers. My thought then was, this was so wrong. I was a child. I think I was about 7. This is so wrong. And I think in our work and today, we define it as gross injustice. And this sparked a curiosity to do something about it, at least not killing children. And I was still very young. Then it translated into you're studying, you're going for a degree. I obtained a business and marketing degree and eventually studied for a master's in criminology and criminal justice. At the start of my professional career, I joined the London Metropolitan Police. So you could see the linkages already. Crime was so much at the forefront of my mind. And my role, because I had taken a business degree, was first as an administrative and finance officer. But then in time, I became a criminal intelligence analyst. Now, before I moved onto the global stage, I was awarded a Metropolitan Police Commendation for professionalism, dedication, and committed in providing analytical lead in child trafficking. So given this background and my childhood and adult experience, I think it should come as no surprise what my path and my career took, and hence my interest from childhood to adulthood.
So you mentioned that you worked for the London Metropolitan Police, and it got you into the criminology scene, and you pursue further studies in it. And then you brought that expertise and knowledge with you to United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime.
Actually, my first introduction to the UN, and I go back again to my childhood, was my father. My father, my late father, I should say, was a UN diplomat. So leaving Uganda was my introduction to the UN, because we were leaving Uganda to Ghana to join my father, who had started working for the United Nations. So that's where it started, really, in terms of not necessarily working, but exposed to what was happening on the international platform. And interestingly, sometimes I do say I did start working for the UN because I recollect when my father would come home with what is now Microsoft Excel spreadsheets, but just paper. And because he was overseeing agricultural initiatives in Africa, we would sit down with him and help him write the list of countries on one column, because he had papers and papers to do that before he did his analysis. So in recounting any exposure, I always say, well, I was an unpaid volunteer, right? Listing all the countries. I mean, I couldn't list them now, but I'm sure I could. But then we'll sit down and write. And I had the best handwriting, so I always got, most of the work. But my exposure in terms of work started as a consultancy. I started off in Uzbekistan and Albania as a consultant, and it was assessing criminal justice responses to human trafficking and smuggling of migrants. And then there was a short gap, and then I moved full-time to Bangkok, which is the UNODC regional office for Southeast Asia. So that was my first introduction to UNODC, working there for 5 years before actually moving to Vienna to then coordinate another project, and then subsequently moved to Ethiopia as the representative for UNODC. I was ad interim, then came back to Vienna, and then the decision to retire started playing on my mind.
What are the core values that guided your leadership?
So the core values really that have guided my leadership is really grounded in a dedication to social impact. If we relate it to my experiences as a child, I was already thinking about gross injustice. Why are people being killed? Why don't we have water? There is a war. We need to stop it. We need peace. We need to live, peacefully. We need this access to health. Aside that, it's also about integrity. I think as a leader, you've got to have that. And I've been guided by that throughout my career. The other, I think, which perhaps is core to my leadership and for the person that I am, is a respect and commitment to diversity and inclusion. And I'm sitting here with you today. A good leader is always open to continuous learning. So it's also in leadership being open to learning. The world is changing now. The world 50 years is different from today. So under that umbrella, I just term it ethical leadership. We can't do what we do as leaders if it's not shrouded in ethics. And so I've led and I continue to lead with empathy and cultural awareness. And I think the cultural awareness came obviously with the exposure of, being on the global platform.
It feels to me that institutions are built for structure. Do you think that it can exist, empathetic, inclusive, ethical leadership? Can it exist in rigid institutions?
Maxine, you ask a very difficult question, but let's see if I can unpack it. And of course, it can exist within rigid institutions. But the issue is navigating the tension between personal values and institutional structures. And from my experience, it really requires strategic decision making. So realigning my values with institution was about balancing my personal beliefs within this structured institution. And the expectations from bureaucratic institutional environments can really make that tension uncomfortable, because the tension is on personal ethics and the constraints that come with institutions. So you're left with adapting your values to fit the system, or you work to change the system. Or you decide when misalignment is too great, it's too much, you leave.
Institutions and the values are completely two different concepts.
Yeah.
The reason why I entered the institutions is because I want to work for the values.
Yes.
not because I want to work for the institutions.
Right.
So it becomes extra hard when you have to fight the institutions in order to uphold the values you believe in.
Yeah.
When you realize that now it's not just the injustice in the world that you are trying to fight against, but also the limitation of institutions that you are battle with.
Yeah.
And how did you process that?
Again, it's about navigating those tensions. How much pressure did I want to put on myself to attempt to change a system, to attempt to change a structure? Institutions prioritize structure, rules, and obviously work towards efficiency. But I think it's the balance. How much pressure am I going to put on myself to a rigid, bureaucratic institution? That is where the sticking point is. And decisions become selfish, don't they? Is it me or is it them?
Or I would say that rather it is your values
Sure.
or their structure.
Yeah. Yeah.
And obviously, in your case, I guess that you prioritized or you became wise enough to prioritize now your values and your well-being.
Sure. Yes. You've hit it. You've hit the nail on the head.
What are these key misalignments, between the institutional structure and your values that eventually pushed you to where you are today?
I was trying to strike a balance. Resilient, or should I adapt? Should I stay? Should I fight? Or should I fight for this change within the bureaucracy? But talking about misalignments, this can be worked around. While others may require direct confrontation, this is where I'm going to stay and do something, others decide to leave because the fight feels to be over. For me, it was a case of balancing my purpose with reality. The key challenge for me was, when do I push for change? Change within the institution or change for me, with me? When do I compromise? When do I step away? I worked for a number of institutions, the UN, the London Metropolitan Police. I worked for an NGO. But just in general, not all institutions are reformable. The UN, bureaucracy, bureaucracy, bureaucracy. London Metropolitan Police is no different. And just thinking through what you were saying, my key misalignments really hinged on, and I really had to think about it, diversity and inclusion. Policies were committing to diversity, but then you look at hiring practices, promotion, and decision-making didn't reflect it. There was limited representation and role models for me. And then you look at bureaucracy. Bureaucracies could reform, could change, but they're also resistant to change. So you could have ideas, but you're faced with a lot of resistance because they're rigid. And I say this, rigid protocols and processes to go. So how much can you fight? And so you've got to work on a shift for yourself. And I know you said we'll come to that, but that's, for me, was the entry of questioning me, questioning myself. What next? How can I still impact, make change, but in a more strategic way that is less pressure for me?
The bureaucracy, like you said,
Right.
is actually also hurting
Yes.
the institution itself.
Yes.
Because not only it blocks about, effectiveness, efficiency, that is secondary.
Yeah.
But the primary problem is that sometimes it's even sabotaging its mission
Yes.
of upholding the principles and values that it is supposed to stand for.
Yes.
And in result, it's hurting its legitimacy in its very own existence. It's losing its credibility in the public view.
Yeah.
I used to be very proud to say that I work for the UN. Now I'm having second thought.
Right.
Because people are asking, but what you are doing when this is happening, right? And I remember 10 years ago, I was already facing these questions, maybe a little bit less frequent than it is today.
Yeah.
The question is about challenging the bureaucracy of the international organizations. And the answer is, ironically, bureaucratic. We're just a neutral organization where we provide, a platform for our member states to come together and discuss and negotiate and come to an agreement.
Yes.
But what kind of agreement? Is it just? Is it fair? Is it in line with our values and principles?
Yeah.
Because if not, then the whole organization is no different from just a conference room.
Yeah.
And are we really that empty? And as you said, the diversity and inclusion is just one layer of it.
It is.
But it's impacting individuals like yourself, like myself so much, because as a minority woman, you are doubling the challenges.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As a female leader in this very traditional structure, what are the unique challenges considering that you are a minority woman working there?
Yeah. And the questions I asked myself over and over again: what's my value as a Black woman in this organization? I took a decision to quit, but we'll come to that. But I had to tell myself I wasn't quitting. I was transforming. And then it goes back to personal values, which then guided my decision to leave. I couldn't handle, and I know I'm saying this again, the institutional rigidity, the bureaucracy, the ethical misalignments and how they were handled. And your question about the male dominance in these spaces, and I've worked for the organizations, it's criminal justice, law enforcement organizations.
It's all male-dominated.
It's quite male-dominated. And just to sort of give it some context, my career started with the Metropolitan Police. So I was an early career professional then. And interestingly, during my time, the police service was found to be institutionally racist. Now, my personal experience tended to maybe border on gender issues, not the racism element. And it could be because I wasn't a police officer. I was a civilian staff member, right? And then I subsequently, within the police, moved into criminal intelligence analysis, so more engagement now with police officers. But I moved to the UN at mid-career to senior leadership, working again with criminal justice officials, male-dominated. And to be honest, I don't think I faced any particular unique, and I emphasize that it wasn't necessarily unique challenges, because they are common. It's not unique to me. These challenges are common. So one, and we hear it often, old boys club culture. Informal decisions are made which excluded women for very critical opportunities. The Metropolitan Police and the UN, no exception to that. Now, addressing this for me was to build strategic relationships and attempt to break that culture. So by participating in these male-dominated spacings, if at all it was possible. So even if it was, we're going down for a drink, inviting yourself, and then you see the horror and the discomfort because you're female going for a drink, and that's really just a loose example, but you can translate that into a workspace. And then the other challenge was the limited representation, which we've talked about, the role models. That was a challenge. The lack of female mentors and senior leaders made, I think, career progression quite isolating. And in addressing this, what I did is, and I hope I became a role model. In whatever space, I could be a role model and mentor for other women. And I do this up until today. But also the other challenge was navigating international spaces. And what came with that was the cultural barriers. And this is particularly maybe perhaps more with my work with the UN. So adapting my communication style. So in direct cultures, and by that I mean, we're in Austria. So maybe I'll say Austria, Germany. And by direct, I mean the way things are handled. It's about being assertive. And then you have indirect cultures. And I use my experience of being and working in Asia. You need a more relational approach for things to work better. So what did I do? You try and find male allies, right? To be able to push that and to help in cultures that are resistant to female leadership. And so having a male advocate is good. So when I relate this, you could see it's not particularly unique. I think the uniqueness comes in on how you choose to address these challenges.
You said that it is essential to have male advocates.
Yes.
And it is true that there are the old boys club side of culture, but there are also men who are supportive to women.
Absolutely.
Sometimes even more so than women to women. So that makes me wonder that this whole gender imbalanced environment that we're struggling in, it's not as simple as men against women or women against men. It's actually people against a culture.
Yes.
And we could find ourselves being confronted by men or women who are equally impacted and influenced by a patriarchal culture of the society.
Yeah.
And they can equally play a part of blocking the gender equality.
Yeah.
And they can equally play a part of supporting women to develop.
Absolutely.
Both women and men. So eventually it comes down to, again, the personal values and choices that we make in specific situations. Whether we decide to be more open, to be more inclusive, and to be more supportive to each other. So my question is actually here is that, do you believe in promoting leadership purely based on gender? Because somehow it feels to me that it's focused more on gender than values. But if we're talking about values of each one of us against a specific culture that is against women, then in my opinion, it should be more about values rather than about gender. Because it can happen that you can have a male boss that are not supportive or supportive, and the same situation equally applies to when you have a female leader.
Sure. Sure. I think you've answered your own question, to be honest.
I did.
And very well articulated. You know,
It's just...
I'm not a gender specialist, neither am I, but I think what comes to mind, and I just add briefly because I think you well articulated it, are values, and it's also about diversity of thought. Women bring a different perspective, men bring a different perspective, the young bring a perspective, the old bring a perspective. So bottom line is diversity of thought. And if you're saying diversity of thought and values, then women need to be seated at the table, men need to be seated at the table. So I think in leadership, bring that balance, bring everyone in, because the issue that affects people is not more for one gender or the other. It's not more for one group of people or the other. Again, that balance question comes in. It's a learning process, it's educational, and I think it's how you present it. You know, if you come in saying, you know, waving the flag, it's gender, it's diversity, that immediately brings the wall up. So I think, again, this is where its strategic leadership comes in. How do you deal with a matter that is deemed so sensitive? Yeah. You know, how do we bring them on board?
This struggle needs to be dealt with strategy, subtlety.
Absolutely.
Because you want to bring people to the side, to this side of a more inclusive, more diverse. Absolutely. You cannot really waving the wand and the flag, and then naturally it just becomes less appealing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Because then it's almost like adopting the same approach of the traditional masculine style of authoritarian commanding others to comply with a new set of rules. Yeah. You know, that is just counterproductive.
It is, it is, totally is.
Yeah. It happened to me as it did to many people. Mm-hmm. Somehow we allow our profession become our identity. What it did to me was quite unhealthy. But, you know, for most people, regardless of our line of career, we tend to believe that, you know, dedication and commitment means that you stick with what you do. It's almost like this very traditional concept of marriage. Yeah. Whether you are happy or not,
stay for life.
Stay for life, because this is what you chose, and you better commit to it, and only that will show your dedication. Do you believe that's true?
I know, that's interesting. Just a thought came to my mind, and what we used to say when people are staying, we say they're part of the furniture. There's a saying, as in, the furniture stays and stays and stays. But in answer to your question, and particularly where it relates to leaving the UN, I spent 4 years examining two things: the cost of staying and the impact of leaving. Now, staying, and you've mentioned it, provides stability. But it meant that I'm in complicity in a system that doesn't change or is resistant to change. Leaving brings uncertainty, but it could create a larger impact, and it could even be pushing for systemic change more effectively from outside the rigid structures. That's what we're doing today. It just dawned on me. We're speaking outside of a rigid structure. You mentioned freedom. It's freedom. I can speak. You can speak and base it on your experiences. But we're conditioned. You mentioned marriage. I've talked about being part of the furniture. We're conditioned to see commitment as staying. We're going to weather the challenges, right? Proving loyalty and we're going to push for that change within, which I did, and you probably did, and so many others did, us, and are still doing. But sometimes we have to think that meaningful form of commitment is knowing when to leave. That's where I was that 4 years ago, 2018 actually. So when an institution's limitations prevents us from making the impact we believe in, right? It becomes, once again, I'm going to balance purpose and reality. Right. And the key challenge is going back to ask yourself, when do I push for change? When do I compromise? And when do I step away? We have to know not all institutions are reformable. Right?
Or at least maybe it's not reformable within our lifetime.
Absolutely. So that's where I was. That, and I think you phrase it as the paradox of commitment. How do we begin to redefine where we're at? We've reached this crossroads. How am I going to redefine my career, but this time on my terms? Mm-hmm.
You wrote this very interesting piece called Quitting is Leading To.
Yes.
Can you unpack this idea?
That quote, quitting is leading to, is attributed to Nelson Mandela. Can't take credit for that, but it was a brilliant quote. And for me, it highlighted the idea that true leadership is not about persistence, but it's knowing when to step back, knowing when to delegate if you're in that situation, or letting go for the greater, wider good. And for me, it's about the wisdom in letting go. So a good leader, I think, recognizes when to step back for fresh ideas. I always say now in my sort of role as a mentor, right? You've got to leave to let the young ones begin, to let the young ones learn from you. So for me, quitting became an empowering leadership decision. And that was the subject of the article. And what it did is it took me down this path where I was deconstructing the person I was. The person that I was when I was in an institution, and what is it that I'm going to do now, i.e. go on this journey of transformation. So you've also alluded to it in an article that you wrote where you were asking yourself, where am I? Who am I without my career? And it's not an easy step to take. I don't know about you, but I felt lost when I quit. And I had to focus the fact that I'm now in this process of alignment to find this person that I think I got lost in an institution, that my values were mixed up with institutional rigidity, bureaucracy, processes, protocols. Yeah. But where am I, in this state? And I'll give you an example, actually, and it's current. In 2023, Jacinda Ardern, the New Zealand's former Prime Minister, what did she do? She resigned unexpectedly, saying she recognized that leadership requires full dedication, and she has stepped down to allow fresh energy in the government. So the crux of that article was, I'm leaving, right? But I didn't just leave, I left at a time that I could take early retirement. I wouldn't have taken that decision at 50 because I think financially it wouldn't have worked for me that way. But I left at that point where I knew I could leave because the organization would accept my early retirement request. So that for me was that empowering leadership decision. I'm leaving to let someone or anyone, take up whatever space I'd left and maybe try and fight rigidity within an organization.
I can imagine the internal fight that you must have been through when you tried to detach yourself from identity, a professional identity that you have built through over 30 years.
Absolutely.
How did this detaching from the organization allowed you to redefine your purpose?
It's a very deep question. And I think I want perhaps your audience or whoever's going to be listening, that my leaving was about choosing where my leadership will have the greatest impact. That's important. And what does that say? I felt that my leadership wasn't having impact within a bureaucratic organization. How did it feel? You mentioned the word freedom. It felt like complete freedom to do something aligned with my purpose, my values. And society, unfortunately, always frames quitting as a failure. And I did think about it. I went through a process. I thought, have I failed myself? Have I failed my family? Have I failed, my loved ones and those around me? But I had to look at it that quitting was strategic leadership. I didn't know that. I had to think it through. It was strategic leadership. And what it did is it set a precedent. And when I say it set a precedent, there was shock. There was horror. You quit? I remember someone saying, you quit the UN? You can't do that.
It's unimaginable for some. Yeah.
But what it has done is it's gradually opening doors. I suddenly bumped into you, or you sent me a message. That was a door, an unexpected door that was open because I was in transition as well. So I think in redefining my purpose, I have to think this. I broke away from bureaucracy. I feel free. And I'm slowly moving into spaces that are more agile, more hands-on. I can speak freely. I'm focusing on my personal values now for fresh perspectives. It's still a journey, right? That journey is less political. It's about me, it's about others. But I'm also exploring different sectors, private industry, NGOs, and seeing how my global experience can be utilized in new and very targeted ways. That's what it's done. It's really a thoughtful process. I continually think about it, but that's essentially what it's done.
I always had this impression about you that, you actually have this kind of inner reflection. You are driven by a purpose, rather than an agenda.
Beautifully said. I have no agenda, but to inspire.
Often, we get caught in between so many different agendas. And it strips us off from our freedom. I remember that during the pandemic, when this incident of George Floyd happened in the US, about police brutality and all that.
Right.
And because we're doing a criminal justice work, and as a communications officer, I thought that it would be appropriate to somehow, not calling names, but somehow remind people of the work our office was doing in implementing a set of rules in law enforcement, how it can be done in a more just way. And I think that this is essential for all countries, in all situations. And the incident was just, like an opportunity for us to put out that reminder for people to shift their focus back on the problem itself rather than making it a political conflict.
Right.
And I got held back.
Right.
I got held back, and I was asked to do some other more, let's say, politically sophisticated topics like multilateralism.
Right.
In that heated moment where the entire world was looking at what happened to George Floyd.
Yeah.
And at that moment, I felt, this was not why I came here.
Yeah.
And probably that was the moment where I really started to wonder the rigidity, as you said, of the institution and its misalignment with my personal values.
Sure.
And then, even up to today, I am still practicing to trying to regain the freedom of talking what I really believe is right.
Yeah.
Even this conversation itself is a part of that process to help me regain that freedom that was taken away from me. We were in very different field of profession. I was in communications, you were in criminology, and it's interesting that we both experienced the same kind of limitation at a different stage of a career.
Absolutely. And it's important to have these shared experiences. Age shouldn't be a factor. People have moments where they are at a crossroads. And suddenly we'll be talking about it, and then you realize we do connect and intersect in experiences, whether they be at different times of, different times of our lives.
Many women, maybe men also, I'm sure men also, struggle with leaving secure jobs for unknown paths. Yeah. How did you navigate that emotionally and practically?
I think, first of all, we've got to acknowledge that life is full of risks.
Yeah.
You're not going to go through life without risks. So you have to ask yourself, and which I did, are you risk averse or risk tolerant? And you pause and think about that. Okay, so the process for me was, I'm having this inner dialogue by myself. It's in my head. I think of it daily. You were questioning your work. I was also questioning, what was I doing? Who am I? Which we've touched on. And whether my career was really fulfilling. Was it fulfilling? And I think leaving an institution on early retirement from the UN was not just leaving. It was, for me, an identity shift. Because I was leaving this institution behind me and I was moving. It's an identity shift. So what did it bring? I told you about the shock horror when people got to know I was leaving. And it was deeply emotional. I couldn't tell you, Mengting. I'm now being a lot more open with it because it was layered with internal conflict within myself. I was fearful, but I kept thinking, I'm going to redefine myself. I'm going to redefine myself. I have to redefine myself. I couldn't sit in this job that I wasn't fulfilled. And so navigating the emotions, navigating this sudden psychological shift, right? Because there's a psychological shift that you need. Really entailed a lot of thought, and it entailed a couple of things, or maybe three things. I was detaching from identity. I'm a UN official. I'm no longer a UN official, though I could say I'm a retired UN official. So after a decade, I worked about 12, 13 years with the UN. And leaving was like I was losing my identity. I really felt that way. And what had I done? I'd coached myself out of the UN. It was 4 years pre the actual decision. So I kept coaching myself and, my story about, seeing coaches, speaking with family, all that. Then there was the grief and nostalgia that came with it. Okay? Mourning. There was a loss, not of a person, but of something, my job. My identity was gone. It wasn't just a job, it was me as well, right? But I had to start thinking of what's the version of me that can exist outside this institutional structure. So I had many days, months, and I still do, of deep reflection. I was grieving because I'd lost this old person, this old self, right? And I started feeling regret. The journey brings with it regret, but I had to sit it through, And I would ask, Margaret, you were too bold about that. Do you know how many people would love to be where you are? But I was suffering also emotionally. I was suffering psychologically because I always had this feeling I could do more, but I can't. I can't within this structure. But I think ultimately layered with that was this now fear of uncertainty. I've left and I'm now venturing into the unknown. What am I going to embrace? Prior to the decision, and it took time, we're looking, up to 4-5 years to arrive at that decision. So I had the life coach, I had the career coach, I sought financial advice, I had deep conversations with my family and friends, all very supportive, of course. But once I left, I had to create the boundaries. I had to create boundaries for my sanity, is the best thing I would say, because people still continued questioning, right? And I used to sit and think, have this quiet meditation and begin to rediscover, going back to the whole topic of realness of you. Who am I? Who am I outside the noise of this predetermined career paths that everybody follows? You're in a job for life, you retire, live happily ever after. That wasn't my journey. And I had to go through these quiet moments to help me reset, rethink, refocus, because if I'm not fulfilled, what is it that I'm going to do? What can I be outside of this secure job? Though these days there's nothing about security in jobs, but that was the perception then, in my thinking.
I came to realization is that the security is an illusion.
It is, yes, because everybody sees, well, you've got, a job in this great international organization, you're definitely set for life. But after spending this time of complete solitude, I did other things. I focused on my wellness, I traveled, but I had to feed my mind as well because I'd paused. So what did I do? I was listening to podcasts, I was reading, but I also had a peace about the way I dealt with things, spending time at home, making sure my home is really spiritually sound, right? I'm a spiritual person in that respect. But the traveling helped me stay connected internationally. I enjoy travel anyway. So that helped me stay connected internationally. I love people. I love culture. I was still feeding my knowledge and I was able to do that. So I think in direct answer to your question, you have to do the internal work. It's not about the outside noise. And that's what I did. And it's been 2 years, by the way, just over 2 years since I left. So it's still a process. Still is a process. And I think having conversations like we're having, I think are so important to the transition because you then realize you're not alone. Because I did feel alone.
How did you navigate this internal dialogue of detaching from your professional identity?
Very simple things, actually, and it's also psychological. Telling myself that I'm not retiring. And keep telling myself, no, I'm not retiring, I'm not retired. I'm simply evolving. Just saying those things to yourself over and over again, I think did help that psychological shift. And then creating new paths that resonate, one with me, myself, my true purpose, and also combining it with the world around. I'm not in isolation. There's a whole world, around us, around me. And so I think the move is I began to be open to new possibilities, ready to share whatever wisdom I've built over the years, share it with people, and having discussions like we're having today, and realizing the journey isn't just about me. And as we've talked, we've seen our shared experiences. It's not just about me. And I think what I've progressed to, and I think I've always been that way, I'm all about inspiring people, inspiring others to embrace change, whatever the change is. If your change is, I'm going to stay within an organization and do ABC, then so be it. And we could work toward that. If it's outside the walls of an organization, we could also work towards that. But I think in embracing change, it's also about being bold. You've got to be bold. And I think it needs a confidence. So I was built in the confidence to be bold. And I think ultimately I'm working on transforming lives, if I can. It sounds very broad and bold, but it's transforming and empowering people into alignment and really discovering truly what their purpose is. I'm doing it for myself because I'm still discovering, but I think that journey is ongoing.
So you talked about this shift, from institutional impact to personal impact. After your retirement, what does leadership mean to you now?
And we talked about it in the discussion, how I guess leadership being equated to a title.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
It's tied to a position. So, i.e., in my case, you work for the UN, right? It's about authority. Yeah. It's about institutional power. And now, and I keep saying it over and over again, leadership to me is about purpose. And it's about creating the change regardless of title. That's what leadership to me is. And we've said it again, it's also about freedom. Freedom from bureaucratic processes, the constraints that come with it, which I think is giving me room to develop my empathetic and authentic leadership. Yeah. That's what leadership for me is now.
The titles to most people are so very important because that shows that you have an institution behind you. How do you see leadership evolving beyond traditional institutional roles? How do you redefine the leadership beyond titles? And what does it mean to lead without an institution behind you?
I think for me now, leadership has, outside the institution, has become more personal. It's about me rather than Margaret and the institution. So by that I mean I'm thinking about mentorship. I'm thinking about shaping conversations from outside the institution. Somewhat still connected, but shaping those conversations. So for example, I no longer have to navigate structures and approvals. So I can directly mentor young adults, which is what I'm targeting. And have those conversations and shape those conversations outside of the institutional barriers. So leadership now for me it's not about the title or position I hold. I need to think about that because I'm sure one day someone would ask, who are you? What do you do? Mm-hmm. But I think my focus is on what is the impact I'm going to make? What's the impact that I'm making now? So I think the key thought around that is that, and you've alluded to it, leadership shouldn't be about the position, shouldn't be about the title, but the impact you make. I'm still navigating this internal dialogue, and it's a process, you know. I've got fears, I've got my hesitations, but I'll tell you how I'm shifting how I think. I'm reframing my conversations. So like I said previously, instead of seeing my leaving a job behind or leaving an institution, I'm beginning to see it as I'm moving into a new chapter. It might be obvious, but I have to keep
reminding yourself.
I have to keep reminding myself that. Yeah. And then thinking around legacy, okay? What have I built over 3 decades of work that I can then use and which will go beyond what my career was? Mm-hmm. And again, if you link it to the mentorship, that's where it comes in, because the legacy is those behind you will carry whatever torch you've handed over to them. And lastly is again that purpose beyond position, right? So my purpose shouldn't and isn't tied to an institution, right? I care about people. So that's where I'm going to refocus my purpose. I care about the younger generation. Mm. That's where I'm going to refocus my purpose. And it's possible to exist in other spaces, new spaces that are not necessarily institutional. So I think having over 3 decades of work, right, what has it done? It's built certain skills around me, certain skill sets, some of it being resilient. I naturally have a network, right, around that I think could help negate the fear of you're not working with an institution. But it doesn't take away the fears still. They still are there. So the fears of regret, okay, I'm going to look at, what's next. I'm going to embrace that. I had the fear of, you're not relevant anymore. Yeah. And if I could use an example, now when I have conversations, and this is not a negative observation, if I meet some ex-colleagues, the narrative of negativity, I don't want to hear it anymore because I've left that space. I actually then begin to think, I'm not relevant in those discussions. I want to embrace newness. I want to embrace invention, something innovative. Yeah. And I need to evolve out of there because you still have the identity crisis, that label still hangs, on there.
Yeah. It's so tightly linked to our sense of self-doubt.
Yes.
And insecurity, which exists in everyone. And I guess that is probably the primal motivation why people are so much hang to their titles and positions. Yeah. Because we need this kind of external affirmation.
Yes.
That.
And the label.
Yes. Instinctively, we need that to balance off our self-doubt and insecurities.
Yeah, you're so right on that. And I think just to conclude, one has to look at the leaving a job, the transitioning. It isn't that I'm starting over, but what I'm doing is leveraging the expertise, the years of expertise that I have, but doing it in a different way, in a new way. Right. I think that's important. Yeah.
I think we become who we are exactly because what happened to us.
Yes.
Thanks to the UN and the experience with the institutions
Of
that
course.
we have gained our professionalism and expertise and skills and knowledge. And that includes a global audience. What legacy do you want to create moving forward with what's given? Because now you are choosing a different form of impact.
Yeah. I think I'll quote Maya Angelou. And she says, I've learned that people will forget what you said.
That one.
People will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel.
Yeah.
What does that mean to me? What does that quote from Maya Angelou mean to me? It's having the ability to shape future young leaders directly through mentorship rather than institutional mechanisms. And it's because institutions create systemic change, which is also important, but I think that mentorship is more direct, it's more personable, and it's transformative for the person rather than the institution. So I think for me, I don't know yet. I might be speaking, I'm sitting on a podcast today, expressing my thoughts, but I think ultimately it could also be shaping institutional change from the outside. Because your mentors will be working in institutions. Mm-hmm. So they are the vehicle, that hopefully will create the change. So I think my legacy, or in creating a legacy, I hope I can influence also diversity in leadership in global spaces. And maybe build this, I'm calling it a portfolio of influence to guide young professionals.
And how can others find the courage to step away from structures that no longer serve them?
It takes a lot of courage, boldness to the unknown. But I would say it's the internal work that we talked about, shifting from your institutional identity to your self identity. And I think my decision to step away was empowering, eventually became empowering. It was an instant. And it was because I wasn't going to be bound by institutions and rules and processes anymore. Mm-hmm. But it was one that was driven by purpose. So we talked about this. We believe in the mission and values of the UN. And I respect the structure and the mission. But I realized that my personal strength and leadership thrives in something more dynamic, something more agile, something more adaptable. So I think to continue growing and contributing effectively, I've begun looking for opportunities where I could make, more direct impact. And I think ultimately, I prefer, or I shouldn't say I do prefer environments that allow for greater innovation, mm-hmm. flexibility, responsiveness. If I'm having mentorship or I'm mentoring, a young adult, it's direct. It's impactful almost immediately. And I think that's where you can get sort of maximum growth and also looking at myself, my professional growth.
If you could advise women in early to mid-career questioning their purpose, what would you say?
It's a difficult question. Honestly, I laugh, but everyone's different. Everyone's different at different levels of psychological strength, if I could put it that way. Everyone's at a different stage in the career. But I think, first of all, recognizing that it's a process. It's not going to happen overnight. And then when you start thinking of it or starting on a journey, you've really got to be focused and intentional. I mean, it's taken me 2 years to get to this point, to be able to be vulnerable, to be able to talk about what I've been through. Some of it's shocking to friends who are close to me. Were you having this internal battle? But for me, mine was letting go of that institutional identity.
Yeah.
I also, if I have to be honest and vulnerable, I hated the fact that people were actually left the UN, and I'd be rolling my eyes inside, thinking the UN was part of my story. So was the Metropolitan Police. So was the charity, shelter homeless charity that I worked for. It is not my entire identity.
Yeah.
Can we shift that discussion?
Yeah.
And then I began feeling that with this questioning, I had a responsibility, a deep sense of responsibility to inspire others. I don't know why I put this on myself, but maybe that's my journey. I need to inspire people. Almost like I want to inspire you into my way of thinking, because it's really liberating. And it's about self-discovery. It's about reflection. It's about knowing what you love. What is it that you're good at? What is it that the world needs? What can you be paid for? So, what would I say? How would I encourage women? I would say success is not about longevity in one place. It is about alignment with purpose. I would also say leadership is not defined by an institution, but by your values and the impact you make. I would also say if you feel constrained in your purpose, just ask yourself, where can I make the most meaningful change? Sometimes the answer is outside of the institution, like we are now, sitting in this podcast and thinking, we're out, we're free. But you said it, traditional careers capture longevity, right? You've got to be there long enough because it shows real commitment. But are you staying true to your purpose? Not just staying in the organization? And I would also say commitment is not about where you work. I had to tell that to myself because at one point, of course I was proud where I worked, but it wasn't just about that. But the key thing is, what is it that you're working towards, right? Are you staying because you believe in change or because it's an easier path? Is your presence driving meaningful progress, or are you just maintaining the system?
The status quo.
Yes, keyword. Would leaving allow you to pursue your purpose more effectively elsewhere? And then ask yourself on a personal level, am I still growing? Am I still making a difference? That's key. Is the institution evolving? Or am I adapting to stagnation? To stagnant, at least for me, and I think for many others. And ultimately, again, the question is, where am I going to use my skills? Where am I putting my energy where it will be valuable? Those are things that I think women, men, young adults really should question themselves. It's not an answer I can totally give. I can give questions for you to really dive into your thought process, but equally important.
And I think that the sooner these questioning starts, this kind of internal dialogue starts, the better. I also try to imagine myself, like if I stayed on, I don't know, until after mid-40s or maybe even near my 50s, I don't know. I will be entirely spending the whole career of my life at the UN at one single institution. And I will be completely molded into this profile. It would be very hard for me to even switch myself, the state of mind, the way of doing things, the understanding of a different world outside where I was existing. And will I still have the flexibility to change myself, to adapt to a different rhythm of doing things, a different style of doing things? Starting that dialogue early enough was also in my advantage, although I was put in the situation, but I was given the chance of reflecting and realigning my purpose and the goals that I want to achieve, so that now I am able to sit where I am, doing things that I believe in and making the change in a different way.
Yes. Really, well said. Well said. And it brings me to the quote by Carl Jung, I'm not what happens to me, I am what I choose to become. And that's what it is. We are becoming what we're choosing.